Welcome to Terror at Collinwood. I have a very exciting episode for you today featuring Jim Beard, Rich Handley, and Charles R. Rutledge. We're really going to get into it. But before we do, I have some exciting news bites for you. Daytime Gothic is back for a second issue in 2024. Stuart Manning posted this. The new issue of Daytime Gothic will be over 130 pages, perfect bound, printed in full color, celebrating Dark Shadows in all its forms with essays, interviews, artwork, humor, and fiction, with proceeds once again going to charity. If you are a writer or a fan artist and you want to get involved, you want to submit your work to issue 2, be sure to drop an email at collinwood80@gmail.com and the guidelines will be provided for you. To receive advance information when the magazine will be available to order, you can sign up for email alerts. I will put a link to that in the show notes. Just the cover image that has been shared here is gorgeous. I assume this is going to be the cover. I hope it is, because it's a beautiful image of Barnabas and Julia, blue and pink. It just looks fantastic. Really looking forward to that. What else have we got? As I've mentioned before, Catherine Lee Scott and Marie Wallace will be doing a meet and greet at Lyndhurst, the mansion used for Collinwood in House of Dark Shadows and Night of Dark Shadows. This will be happening on Saturday and Sunday, October 21st and 22nd, 2023, from 10:30 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. and 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. on both days at the Lyndhurst Welcome Center. Tickets are $50 per person plus service fees. I will put a link to that in the show notes. That looks like it's going to be a really fun event just in time for Halloween. More exciting news, as I mentioned last time, Volume 2 of Our Shadowed Past is coming. Bob Issel has announced that the deadline for submissions for Volume 2 of Our Shadowed Past has been extended to October 20th. Our Shadowed Past features articles from fans about their experiences with Dark Shadows, how they discovered Dark Shadows, what Dark Shadows means to them, and you are welcome to submit as well. Bob is looking for articles where you talk about your past with Dark Shadows and your present with Dark Shadows, and anything you want to say and explore. He usually asks for 2 photos, a present day photo and also a photo from your childhood during the time when you first started watching Dark Shadows, or when you used to watch Dark Shadows as a kid, or when you discovered it, sort of like a then and now kind of thing. And you want to send your submissions, or if you have any questions, to bobubas59@gmail.com, bobubas59@gmail.com. And again, the deadline for book submissions and photos is now October 20th, 2023. And the original book is available in Kindle format at Amazon. I will put a link to that in the show notes. Sensational book. And continuing on, the Dark Shadows Daybook Unbound by Patrick McRae is now available as an audiobook at Audible, read by Mary D. Johnson, and it is available over on Audible. You will not be disappointed. The next episode, I think it'll be the next episode of Terror at Collinwood, will feature Patrick and Mary talking about that experience, and you can hear all about it. But you can get the audiobook of the Dark Shadows Daybook Unbound right now at Audible. I will put a link to that in the show notes. And finally, I will be doing an appearance, or rather Penny Dreadful will be doing an appearance at Monster Expo on Saturday, October 14th and Sunday, October 15th at the Taunton Conference Center in Taunton, Massachusetts. From what I am told, the whole convention will be in 3D, so that'll be exciting. I don't know how they're going to pull that off, but I look forward to finding out. And I was asked to do a Dark Shadows panel at the convention. It's going to be like a Dark Shadows 101 kind of panel. I was asked to kind of do an introductory panel for the Dark Shadows curious among us. For those who may be interested in learning more about Dark Shadows, I'm going to give like an overview of the show and talk a little bit about the characters, etc. So I think that panel will be happening on Saturday. I'm not sure what time it'll be. When I find out, I will mention it here. And I think that's it. So let's get to the show. There's nowhere to run. there's no place to hide. This podcast is fun, but there are spoilers inside. Welcome to Terror at Collinwood. I am your hostess, Penny Dreadful, transforming into the more mild-mannered Danielle, and I am joined here by my three special guests, Jim Beard, Rich Handley, and Charles R. Rutledge. Jim and Rich are returning to the podcast, and Charles is a first-timer here at Terror at Collinwood, although I've been wanting to bring him on for a while, so I'm glad I'm able to get these three titans here to discuss our topic today. So just a quick intro here. Jim Beard has written official Spider-Man, X-Files, and Planet of the Apes prose fiction, Star Wars, and Ghostbusters comic stories, and contributed articles and essays to several volumes of comic book and pop culture history. He has served as editor on several books, including Rising Sun reruns, D20 or Die, several books on Batman 66, and of course, Running Home to Shadows. Along with John S. Drew, he's the host of The Doctor's Beard, a Doctor Who podcast. Rich Handley has authored fiction titles, features, and columns for Lucasfilm's licensed Star Wars universe. Rich served as a reporter for Star Trek Communicator magazine and has also written for several other genre magazines and websites, including Cinefantastique, Cinescape.com, which is now Mania.com, Dungeon/Polyhedron, Toons, the animation magazine, Star Trek magazine, Sci-Fi Invasion, and Simian Scrolls. He was the editor of Musings on Monsters, Observations on the World of Classic Horror. And finally, Charles R. Rutledge is the author of Dracula's Return and co-author of 3 novels in the Griffin and Price Supernatural Suspense series, written with James A. Moore. His short stories have appeared in over 30 anthologies, including A Winter's Tale, Horror Stories for the Yuletide, Occult Detective Quarterly Presents, and Karnaki, The Lost Cases. He owns entirely too many editions of the novel Dracula, keeps actual soil from Transylvania on his desk, and is seldom seen in daylight. And in fact, for the YouTube viewers of this episode, you can see that Charles was telling us that his image does not appear on camera, and thus that is why you just see his name here. So welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh my goodness. Well, it's great to have you guys back here. Well, Rich and Jim, I've communicated with since we've been on. They've been on the podcast, and Charles, we've messaged each other a few times too. But before we get to, I want to talk to Charles a little bit about his background on Dark Shadows, because I picked your brains, Rich and Jim, about how you got into Dark Shadows. But how have you guys been? Like, I haven't seen you in a while, so how are things?
Good. I'm here with 2 of my most favorite collaborators and one of my favorite horror hosts. So how bad could it be, right?
Same, actually.
Good.
This is historical because Charles and I have never interacted like live.
Really?
Yeah.
Only dead.
Only through seance.
Rich and I go way
Jim and
back.
I interact undead.
Yes.
Yeah,
we've never actually spoken, so
Right. Yeah, this is
hi, Jim.
We're making
actually the same is true for me and Charles.
That is true.
I've worked
really?
with Charles too,
okay.
and also never interacted with him. So yeah.
Okay.
Oh wow.
I mean verbally, yeah.
Yeah, because I know you've all been involved heavily in these books together,
yeah.
like Musings on Monsters and Running Home to Shadows and many other projects. So cool. Well, Charles, as I said, Rich and Jim both told me about how they got into Dark Shadows. So what's your story with Dark Shadows?
I don't actually remember where I first saw it. I was born in 1962, so my memory gets going pretty good about 1968.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know I was watching the show actually with one of my grandmothers, and it was kind of a just one of those things where I saw it and immediately was taken with it. My first and strongest memory of it is the episode where Barnabas thinks he's escaped the dream curse. He walks outside and the bat attacks him. And that was like a major thing as a kid. I was like, holy cow. So yeah, just kind of stumbled across it really.
Were you a horror fan or monster kid at that time yet, or was Dark Shadows
Yes,
your?
I was already there. My mom actually, I wouldn't call her what we think of today as a fan, but she did enjoy speculative fiction. She collected Tarzan novels and comics, and we would watch the Dialing for Dollars show in the afternoons.
Yeah.
And you had that, and they would have, like Classic Monsters Week. You get a week of Frankenstein, you get a week of Dracula, drop in some Gamera, Tarzan. So yeah, I was very much already into that sort of thing.
Fantastic. Yeah, I used to love Dialing for Dollars. I used to watch that too. You'd see.
They never called me.
Yeah.
I don't think we had that up here. We had,
Yeah.
I don't recognize that either.
Yeah.
the movie theme weeks, but I don't think we
The 4:30
had
movie.
for dollars.
Also, it sounds like Charles stole my childhood. I want it back.
I remember watching the Martian Chronicles on Dialing
Oh,
for
yeah.
Dollars. Yeah.
Huh.
They never called me either. I never got a call from Dialing for Dollars.
I feel very cheated now. So,
Well, I don't know what Dialing for Dollars is either. I just know I watched Martian Chronicles.
It was
But,
like it was a movie show, but you could win money. Like they would
I
randomly
see.
call people in the area,
Oh.
and you could win money. And the guy, at least on the Boston channel, it was like this big tank filled with like these ping pong balls with I don't know.
Same thing.
Yeah, and then they randomly pick one, and it would be they'd call the number on it or something.
Realistically, they were probably using the Atlanta phone book, and I wouldn't have been in it, so I had no chance.
Yeah. We also
now I have
We,
to go and ask my parents if we had that in Toledo.
Yeah,
We
I
also-
don't think we had that in New York, but we had WPIX where they would play like Space Invaders and kids would call in and yell "Pix," and somebody at WPIX would push the button. And clearly the guy playing the game wasn't paying any attention to what the kids were saying because the kids would go "Pix, Pix, Pix," one shot.
Yeah.
Pix, Pix, another shot. So it was very funny. That was about the only way anybody won money in my area.
Well, we in addition to that, we also had, Friday Night Frights. We had a local horror host, Dead Ernest.
Oh yes,
So-
Deadly. Yes, yep.
Yeah. So we had all of that. So yeah, I was very much into the monster thing pretty
Cool.
early on.
Very cool. Yeah, we had a Creature Double feature here, which was not hosted. At least when I was watching it, it wasn't hosted. At some point, Svengoolie syndicated clips from Chicago to Boston, and yeah, so we had Svengoolie for a little while. But it was a double feature on Saturday at noon. It was like Saturday afternoon. Instead of going outside, I was watching Creature Double. If they were showing The Mummy's Hand or House of Frankenstein or something like that, or Gamera or Godzilla, King Kong versus Godzilla, which they showed in way too much, but I watched it every time it was on.
Oh yeah.
So
That's me. I was Sir Graves Ghastly.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
he was like late Saturday morning, early Saturday afternoon. But my brother got the Ghoul like late at night out of the Cleveland area.
Mhm.
And to this day, I've never actually seen the Ghoul. I wasn't allowed to stay up. He's 4 years older than me, but that was okay because Sir Graves Ghastly was everything in the world to me at that point.
Sir Graves Ghastly was amazing. He was just such a classic, great horror host. And I guess the Ghoul was great too, but he was more of like a anarchist, like the kind of the teenage crowd, I think, was way into the Ghoul because he was a descendant, I guess, of Ghoulardi, and he was putting, Froggy in the blender and blowing things up and stuff. And Sir Graves Ghastly was just very theatrical and hamming it up, but he was just so much fun. Did you
get Chiller Theater in your area with the 6-fingered hand coming out of the graveyard?
I wish. No, I didn't. That intro is classic though for that show.
So I do it with just the 6. Yes. Chiller.
Yeah. It's great. It's great. It's like a claymation hand, isn't it?
Yeah. It was a really bad stop animation with clay.
Yes.
I'm gonna have to look that up.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. It's I would imagine it's probably on YouTube.
Yeah. I'm sure it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know I've seen it before.
So, yeah, it's gotta be.
Yeah. So did Charles, did you continue to be after that initial exposure to Dark Shadows, did you continue to watch it all the way through, or was it sort of sporadic? Or
No, I watched it all the way through.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think I watched, the final part where they weren't in the Prime universe, I guess. I
Mhm.
don't remember that at all. I think I must have gone, well, where's Barnabas? I'm out of here.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Yeah, the
I don't
end
think
of
you
this.
were alone in that.
Yeah.
You beat me to it, Rich.
Yeah.
Yes, and Sue Barnabas had to do that.
And I recently had Elena Nicanther on, who was Jonathan Fritz's personal assistant during the run of Dark Shadows, and she explained, gave a little insight about why that happened. And if you watch that Jonathan Fritz documentary, that Mary O'Leary director, there's another
yeah.
component in there that shows Dan Curtis and Jonathan Fritz were not seeing eye to eye because Jonathan didn't want to do Night of Dark Shadows, and of course Dan Curtis was infamous for his temper, so he was not happy about that. At one point he was going to fire Jonathan Fritz from being Barnabas, and then he didn't.
Unreal.
Yeah, and then he decided instead, he was basically that if you don't want to play Barnabas in the movie, you're not going to play him in the show, and told the writers to create a Bramwell, so where Jonathan played a different character, and I'm sure he enjoyed playing a different character. He got the chance; everybody else got the chance to play a different character. So, but Dan, I mean, I love what the work Dan Curtis did, but he was known for having a sort of a temper. So
at least half the cast at some point has commented on the fact that they were scared of him.
Yeah, yes, he was brilliant. I mean, he was brilliant, and I'm so glad that that he's remembered to this day for all that he, not only the horror stuff he did, but Winds of War and War and Remembrance, Dark Shadows, all these great, Kolchak, and so many other great things. That great version of Jekyll and Hyde he did with Jack Palance. There's so Burnt Offerings, so many great things that he did. But yeah, he definitely could have a temper.
Funny how often that happens, where you like love the man's work, but you can't love the man.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Gene Roddenberry and all the stories of his little, personal peccadillos and things like that. But he created Star Trek.
Exactly. Exactly.
It's a great example, Jim. And Jim and I, build our lives around the work of Gene Roddenberry, basically.
Yeah.
But there's no denying that as time went on, the image he portrayed of himself didn't quite match the reality of himself.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I've heard Darren McGavin, you could have these big blow-ups and kind of like that. So
that's the time when you really just have to focus on the work.
Yeah.
And try to remember, why you love the what they've created, and try not to worry too much about unless it's something, that you just can't look past, like, they gave money to the Nazi party or something.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
that,
As someone who is a great fan of Joss Whedon's work, I get what you're saying. And
there you go.
The same thing.
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. I was disappointed.
That was a bummer
when all that stuff came out about his behavior. That's not cool at all.
Thankfully, no one ever said that about Jonathan Fritz, because that would have been devastating.
I have only ever heard good things about Jonathan Fritz ever. It's you brought up Joss Whedon. I had recently Todd McIntosh, who is a Emmy award-winning makeup artist on the show, and he worked on Buffy the Vampire Slayer. He also worked on the 2004 Dark Shadows pilot that never got picked up, but he's a big Dark Shadows fan, and it made me even angrier at Joss Whedon because Todd went to one of the Dark Shadows festivals and talked to several of the actors and got their contact information, and went to Joss Whedon and pitched the idea of bringing having an episode with Dark Shadows characters, like a crossover thing with, I don't remember which actors. I don't know if these points mentioned.
That would have been wild.
I think Lara was one of them, I'm pretty sure. And Joss Whedon shot it down. He didn't want to do it. Isn't that a pain? Even if it wasn't the characters from the show, it would have been, I don't know if the characters from Dark Shadows, I don't think they would fit as well.
Could it be because they had gotten older?
Maybe. I don't know.
I mean, he built Buffy, other than, Giles, he built Buffy around young, attractive people, and maybe he felt he couldn't do that with that cast.
Well, I think it would have been a cool, like, one-off episode to have, even if it's not the characters from Dark Shadows, but maybe just playing something similar, like as a nod to it. I
Yeah.
think that
Oh no,
would
I think that would have been fun.
yeah,
I mean, heck,
totally.
he did a Dracula episode. Why not do a Cohen Sport episode?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Mhm.
As a
Anyway,
comic book guy, I'm all for the crossovers.
I
Yeah.
love that kind of stuff too, or just a nod or a shout out to it. Like in the Supernatural series, they did an episode where the vampires are watching an episode of Dark Shadows, and
Yeah,
they
yeah.
comment on why do they get to live in a mansion?
It's so funny that you were bringing up Darren McGavin because it reminds me of how we were robbed of the Kolchak X-Files crossover
Yes.
because Darren didn't want to play it. He'd be on the show, but he didn't want to play Carl, again. So we got Darren twice, but
Yeah.
I
We
mean,
got kind of an
we got
unofficial
that
one.
at least.
It
We got
kind of
kind of
was.
an unofficial one when the show came back, and they were clearly doing a Kolchak without Kolchak.
Definitely.
Oh,
yes.
yes. Yeah.
The seersucker suit and the hat.
Yep.
Yeah.
That was hilarious.
I remember we're sitting there watching it going, why is that guy dressed like Kolchak? Is he supposed to be dressed like
Same.
Kolchak?
I'm like, what? What?
I laughed the whole time through that episode. I was like, "This is very clever," because
Yeah.
they got their cake and they ate it too.
Right. And that actor, it was he was in the movie version of What We Do in the Shadows. He was we're werewolves, not swearwolves, that guy. And he was also in Flight of the Conchords. But yeah, they did bring Darren McGavin into X-Files. He was in it, at least, as he was like the founder of the X-Files.
Yeah, well, that's
Yeah.
the cool thing is that
Yeah.
Chris Carter is always credited Kolchak as a huge inspiration for X-Files, and so Darren got to be the creator, the founder of the actual X-Files in the show.
Yeah. Oh,
Well,
it's great. Yeah.
Yeah, I would have loved to see it. Unlike Charles, I'm not as big a fan of crossovers, and I think that would have been a whole lot of fun.
Yeah.
And let's not forget the time that Kolchak met Barnabas.
Yes.
Of course.
Mark Dawidziak.
Yeah, in a comic and in a short story.
Yes.
Right. That's right.
Yeah, I had Mark on the podcast, and he told a great story about going to Dan Curtis's office, and Dan liked Mark. So it was great hearing stories about Dan Curtis and his interactions with Dan Curtis and pitching this idea to Dan. And he said Dan loved the idea of having his two big horror guys meet each other. I was like, oh, that is, and it's a great story too. If you haven't read it, it's
it's a lot of fun. Yeah.
Yeah. So
if they had done the Buffy connection, that would also put Kolchak in the Buffyverse.
That's right. The
Because of
shared
that,
universe.
because of Mark's crossover.
Right. There you go.
Right.
There you go. They did. We could just keep going. I want to. As you can see, we're already down this rabbit hole of pop culture and talking about all these different things.
What we do.
And that is the reason why.
In the shadows.
Yes.
In or out of the shadows, it's what we do.
Yes.
Well, rabbit holes are usually dark, right?
Yes. Indeed. Maybe Bunnicula is in there. So the reason I wanted to gather the three of you here today is that you've touched on many corners of horror, fantasy, and science fiction, and your spelunking, as I said, into pop culture and speculative fiction has included Dark Shadows, but also many other things. And given that you've kind of seen it all from all of these different perspectives, and that you've done deep dives into many of these different pop culture worlds, I'd like to hear your thoughts on how and where you feel that Dark Shadows fits into this overall collage, I guess, of pop culture, and specifically into monster culture as well. It's interesting looking at the audiences for Dark Shadows, because we have the monster kids, definitely the horror fans. That's a big part of it, especially kids who are growing up in the 60s and were big monster kids, love Dark Shadows. There's also there's soap opera fans that like soap operas and are not necessarily horror fans that like Dark Shadows. There are the teen magazine fans that are fans of specific actors and are really into that and like Dark Shadows, but the focus is more the actors. And that sort of thing. So you have these different audiences for the show, but if we look at just the pop culture landscape based on your experiences. And we'll go, I guess we'll go, Jim, Rich, and Charles, what your thoughts are on all of that.
You know, I think you kind of hit upon it there, is that if anything, Dark Shadows is, you know, multi fandom, you know, that you can kind of get into it in so many different ways. I think I've chuckled, and when I think about all of the soap opera mothers and ladies at home who were exposed to stuff that they would probably never have been exposed to, you know, ever before, and that's kind of wonderful in a way, because they didn't stop watching, right? You know,
Yeah.
so now I'd love to know how many of them then went on to, did they start reading vampire novels? You know, did they start reading Lovecraft? You know, if they had any idea what that is. So that's a tough one of where to place it. I mean, as far as Monster Kids go, I think that it was cemented the day that it ended up in Famous Monsters. You know, that's when it made that big transition, that if Forey Ackerman thought it was good enough to be in Famous Monsters, then I think every monster kid was probably more accepting of it at that point if they hadn't watched it. You said it kind of before the show when we were talking online or whatever. I do worry that it is starting to be forgotten a little bit, and I know we want to talk about that down the road. I think it might be slipping away, you know, somewhat compared to other things. But I mean, it's definitely has probably the biggest place in vampire fiction. I think that's probably what's its legacy is going to be. Despite all the other kind of monsters and all the other storylines, I think it's probably always going to be remembered for Barnabas. You know, a character that wasn't even there in the beginning, but literally just took over the show. That's probably what I'm going to say is that that's its biggest spot in pop culture and definitely in monster culture.
Rich, how about you?
Well, I hate to be one of those guys who says what Jim said, but what Jim said. The
I'd
thing
be
is,
honored. I'd be honored, sir, if you said that.
I think the one area where I disagree with Jim is about the fact that it's going to slip away, and I'll tell you why. It's a very simple reason. How many soap operas can you name that are in a complete box set missing only minus one episode? But
Sure.
Most soap operas are never collected in physical media. You would need a box set the size of this room, for example, for General Hospital or All My Children. But the fact is, it exists in physical media, which is huge, and it's on multiple streaming services. And because of books like Jim's and others that have come out, new fans keep running into it. So where I will amend Jim's answer, which was an excellent answer, is that I think its place is that it is something that transcends. It's not just a soap opera, because soap operas are often forgotten. How many people today can describe, other than diehard All My Children fan, how many people can describe the first 10 years of All My Children? So it's transcended soap operas because most fans can discuss the entire run. It transcends horror because most horror does not start out as a non-horror vehicle. Most horror doesn't start out as Jane Eyre. So it transcends. It transcends soap operas as well, because most soap operas do not have a list of about 40 or 50 different pieces of literature that it's based on, right? I mean, the list is staggering. Jim mentioned Lovecraft. How many soap operas would ever have a connection to Lovecraft?
Right.
And, you know, that Leviathan arc is just not the kind of thing that was on any 60s show, let alone really a one take soap opera, right? And so I think that where I would place this show is that it is a soap opera that completely transcended the genre, and for that reason, I disagree that it'll be forgotten.
Okay,
Let's circle back on that. I won't do
Okay.
it now, but I have an addendum to that too.
Yeah.
Okay. And Charles?
Well, to Jim's question, I mentioned I was watching it with my grandmother, and she definitely was only there for the, relationship stuff, the soap opera stuff. She didn't care about the monsters at all. But I do think that makes an interesting point, because I was actually discussing this with Jim and my mutual friend, Cliff Biggers. It sort of brought, the generations together, because my grandmother could watch it just like she watched Guiding Light or Days of Our Lives. And I was getting, basically Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman in daily doses. So yeah, I think it definitely, crossed those two different territories, and was different things to different people. I think the major thing it did was, there's my cat. Sorry.
Hi, Bruce.
Yeah, he's on the desk. Okay. The major thing it did was make the idea of a human vampire. Everybody's done it since. We've seen that over and over. Like, he basically is just a human being that drinks blood. Dracula was a monster. Most of the other vampires, even Ruthven, those guys, they're monsters. They're predatory creatures. Their sole purpose is to propagate the vampire species, to commit evil simply for the sake of being evil. Barnabas was human. Even when he was at his most vampiric, he regretted it. So how many times have we seen that since, over and over? And Dan Curtis carries it on to his Jack Palance Dracula, which influences the Francis Ford Coppola Dracula.
Mhm.
I mean, it's a big, big thing in the history of horror.
Big time. Yeah.
Angel.
I mean, you can go all the way back to, Blackula, and with the reincarnated Lost Love, and Anne Rice, the Anne Rice vampire. She was a Dark Shadows fan. It's just
you can also go back in the other direction and get your namesake, because the Penny Dreadful Varney the Vampire.
Correct. Yes.
But most people hadn't read it, so a lot of people credit Dark Shadows for that.
Yes, I want to, and I'm wearing a T-shirt of Dracula's daughter, Gloria Holden as a Countess Zaleska. There are precursors, to Barnabas. I love, it's an underrated movie, I think, Dracula's daughter, and Varney the Vampire.
It's the definition of underrated.
It's a cool
underappreciated.
Movie. But Rich and I talked about this when we did the Adam storyline discussion. Barnabas was not the first sympathetic vampire, and somebody recently called out one of the guests for saying, Barnabas was the first sympathetic vampire, and he was aware of the precursors. But I think when Rich and I talked, it isn't that a lot of the people that I've had on the podcast are certainly aware of Dracula's daughter. Even House of Dracula, John Carradine's Dracula and House of Dracula has some he wants to be cured of being a vampire. There's some sympathetic element there, and Varney the Vampire, as Rich said, is probably the first sympathetic vampire in fiction. But Barnabas was the first that made a huge impact, to the point where I think, as Mark Dawidziak said when he was on the podcast, it created a split in the predatory vampires that Charles described, and the more sympathetic vampires with a conscience that Barnabas embodied. Barnabas had qualities of both. Barnabas could be very dangerous and scary too, but he was also guilt-ridden, and Jonathan Frid loved playing those light and dark elements. But Barnabas was not the first sympathetic vampire. He was just the most important sympathetic vampire.
And I think that's a good distinction, because I think the average fan might not know about Varney, and so I think Dan Curtis and Jonathan Frid deserve a lot of credit for the fact that Barnabas made that something that it was expanded upon afterwards. Even if it wasn't the first, it was far more impactful than what came before.
Well, I think that's the key
Yeah.
point, because
Mhm.
you always have, like, there was heroic fantasy before Tolkien.
Yeah.
There was cosmic
Right.
horror
Exactly.
before
Yeah.
Lovecraft. You know,
Yeah.
you can go back to Shakespeare,
Right.
but there's always the guy who crystallizes it.
Mm-hmm.
And it was Barnabas.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And my thought is that Barnabas couldn't have happened anywhere else but on a soap opera. That probably informed what the character became, because they were, the sympathy part was that the audience was predominantly women. For the most part.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the fact is the reason that he continued was because they were wise enough to realize he needed to be somebody they could that those watching it, the housewives could and the children
Right.
could relate to.
Well, I think
If Jason McGuire had stayed on the entire series, at no point would it have spawned an entire genre of con men trying to steal,
yeah, right, yeah.
children, right?
Well, they had to sustain the vampire. And also, I mean, even in the early episodes where Barnabas was really bad, but he had those glimmers of that you would, even when I was a kid and I was watching it, he'd have one of the lines he said, they were talking about the predator, that the person, that the attacker in Collinsport that attacked Maggie Evans, etc. He was talking to, it was Dr. Woodard. He said, "You almost sound like you admire him." And Barnabas said, "No, in fact, I loathe him very deeply." And this was, one of the early episodes.
Yeah.
He infused some of the way he delivered the line. There was an element of self-loathing there in your heart kind of, and then when they introduced Sarah, the ghost of Sarah, his sort of conscience, into the mix, then you really start to feel for Barnabas. So it was certainly the soap opera format enabled
if it
them
was,
to
if it was a
explore
single movie, you wouldn't have all
Yes.
that time to grow all that, to experiment.
Which is why House of Dark Shadows is the way it is.
Yes.
Right, exactly. To get viewer feedback.
Yeah.
And they'd say, okay, well, I think we're heading in, or, again, it probably couldn't have happened the way it did on
Right.
anything but a soap opera.
And Dan Curtis, it's an interesting thing too, because Dark Shadows is also, like Rich mentioned, the Penny Dreadfuls. Dark Shadows is a throwback to that. The soap opera format happened to work very well in that serialized Gothic style, where you get one chapter at a time as the story unfolds. And a lot of that fiction that was really Jekyll and Hyde was Shilling Shockers. They were released in installments. And Dark Shadows kind of with a cliffhanger and everything, and this these heightened emotions and things like this. It totally dovetailed that, because Dan Curtis didn't want to do a soap opera. He pitched Dark Shadows as a nighttime show. They gave him the soap opera format to use, the daytime. So he's like, oh, and then he did what he wanted with it, which was started out as the Jane Eyre Gothic romance, more Anne Radcliffian kind of a thing, but it evolved into this Gothic romance blend of dark fantasy kind of thing. But that serialized format worked very well. And now a lot of these shows like that, those horror shows and fantasy shows, genre shows, tend to be serialized. Like, you have to watch each chapter to find out what happens next. People take that for granted now, and Dark Shadows kind of broke the mold in that. Well, no, it's not true. Doctor Who did too, but Doctor Who was like, it was contained, it was a one story, right? But it was
not
still
every
call them
episode
serials.
was a cliffhanger.
Yeah.
They're anywhere from 3 to 6 to 8, sometimes 12 parts. But there's
a conclusion at the end of each story, though. At the end of whereas Dark Shadows had 1,224 cliffhangers.
Yeah,
which is kind of absurd when you think about it.
Yeah. So does that make Doctor Who a soap opera too? Like, is all serial? Like comic books, for example. Like, I've heard a lot of people say that too. Like, comic books now are soap operas because they're like dealing with a lot of relationship stuff in addition to the superhero adventure stuff. But they always you have to when I was a kid, I remember I would just pick up an issue of a comic book and I could read the story and it would be self-contained in a lot of those issues. Now they tend to be very serialized in the style.
Spider-Man is considered to be a comic book soap opera part, the original, the first Spider-Man, and I think Stan Lee even had said that that's the way he was writing it. That's the way he was, like putting it together, because it was almost more about Peter's personal life than necessarily him fighting bad guys in a costume. I think a lot of people were picking up that book to see, was he going to end up with Gwen or was he going to end up with Mary Jane?
I've been reading a lot of those issues lately.
Was he going to ever get paid by J. Jonah Jameson?
Yeah.
So that was most definitely soap operatic.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've been reading those issues and you're totally right. I have a collection, I picked up a collection. It's the Gwen State when Green Goblin kills Gwen Stacy. Spoilers for sorry, I should have said spoiler. No, it's spoilers for comic books from 50 years ago, but which is the same with Dark Shadows. I always put a spoiler tag at the beginning of the show, but yeah, it is kind of like that. It does have that kind of thing going on. You said you wanted to circle back, Jim, and say something else. So
I want to explain myself a little bit and what I'm talking about as far as the concern about it slipping away. For things to last, obviously, it has to start to draw in new people. And that would be where my concern is. There's the Dark Shadows audience, and I would say for the most part that they've been around for all this time now. I worry that it's not accessible. And by that I mean not accessible to new people coming in. You have to admit it's probably pretty daunting when you have how many episodes is it? It's over 1,000.
1,225.
There you go. Even if you have a fan who says, "Oh, well, I can point you to, the best parts." To me, it's something where you're not really maybe getting the, everything. You're not seeing the lead ups to thing. If you're jumping in at, okay, I'll say the Dream Curse, how you're not getting everything that led to that point.
Right.
By the way, I would not recommend jumping into the Dream Curse. But yeah.
Now be careful. I knew somebody who loved the Dream Curse.
I love the Dream Curse.
I don't mean
I
love it,
but I would
to denigrate the storyline. Just that would be a really bad start.
No, I know. I just, you know what? I
follow what
off the top of my
I just mean that's a
head,
storyline that if you'd never seen what came before, you might not watch.
I always say 1897 is a good place to jump in. Episode 700.
There you go. But Rich made a great point as far as it's one of the only soap operas that's on physical media, and that in itself is a good thing. But again, having that many episodes, that many storylines, that many characters that change so much, different realities, how accessible is it to a new person? How daunting it is. I'm not.
I can tell you that I have 3 friends right now watching it for the first time, and all of them reporting into me.
Yeah,
okay.
Awesome. Where did you have them start, Rich?
It's
always the beginning.
Okay, that's what
Barnabas?
I was going to say is.
What's that?
You had them start.
I think that the only way to watch the show is from episode 1.
Awesome. Good. Cool.
As an OCD person, I would agree with that. But see, I don't know if I could necessarily honestly tell somebody to start at the beginning and have to, sorry folks, slog through all of that to get to Barnabas.
I think there would be a lot of people who would tap out.
Yeah.
Even honestly, I had a friend who loved Barnabas and started watching those early Barnabas episodes, and even she tapped out because I think it was still too slow for her. I'm like, really? Like, even but I think once you get to
other thing.
Yeah.
That's the other thing. I am in a position where MASH, the TV show MASH, is a large part of my life. I won't go into detail of why that is, but I talk to people all the time about it. It is slipping away more and more. It is probably the greatest TV show of all time, if not one of the, greatest TV shows of all time. But I see it all the time. Young people, they don't know it unless they have a parent or a grandparent that are sitting them down and saying, watch this show, it's valuable. There is worth here, and hoping that they will pick up on that same thing. But again, I don't know, if you're not starting from the beginning, MASH is not the greatest example as far as you probably can come in at different places with MASH. But that's that same feeling that I have with Dark Shadows, is that I worry that the core fandom is aging out, and if we're not having a good influx of a lot of new or younger people, then what happens to Dark Shadows? That Star Trek doesn't have that problem, Star Wars doesn't have that problem. I'm trying to think of other big things, but
Planet of the Apes. What is the difference? Let me ask you that. Like, what continues to bring new people in to Star Trek, Star Wars, Planet of the Apes?
Modern day versions of the franchise.
New iterations.
New iterations.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what's the difficulty, is like, if you looked at, there have been 3 attempts now to bring, 4 attempts to bring back Dark Shadows. The first one lasted a dozen episodes. The second one only lasted a half an episode. The third one was a film that tanked, and the fourth didn't even get made. So that's the problem, I think, right there. If the show came back and succeeded, everything Jim is validly concerned about would go away, because people would watch it to catch up, the same way they do with the original series on Star Trek.
It's what happened with Doctor Who too. I mean, right? I mean, when they went back. They went back and watched the old stuff because they got into it, and they said, I want to see what came before. That's why I've been on the cheerleading Mark B. Perry's Reincarnation show, which hasn't gotten off the ground, but I heard from him recently, and
I hope it does.
He hasn't given up on it. I mean, the writer's strike and everything kind of has slowed things down, but he said, I'm still climbing Widow's Hill. I'm determined to see this through. He's really trying to get it on one of the streaming channels. I do know that the Burton film did hurt things a bit in some places, because people had a bad reaction to that. But I think I like the idea of coming in, doing a serious sequel series to the original series, where everything still happened in the original show, but now we find out what's going on now. We can explore what happened in the interim. There's a lot of room to play there. And I agree.
Do it while we still have surviving cast members.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Because I think that's one of the things with Doctor Who in particular, is it's not a reboot. It's just what's happening later. And they've really made a good effort, especially in the last couple of years, to bring in old companions, old enemies, the actors who are still alive. I thought, getting Ace back was genius.
It was Ace.
There is also
Ultraman did that same sort of thing.
Yeah.
Ultraman being almost the Japanese equivalent to Doctor Who, as far as, a culturally significant show within its own country, and that has been running almost continuously since the 1960s. And for the most part, the Showa continuity lasted up until 1980, and then they picked it up again much later on with a show. Isn't it terrible? It flew out of my head. But later on, after the year 2000, they picked it up again. But that's that same thing, is that they keep connecting back. They all of the main actors are still alive, and they will bring them back as much as possible. Sometimes the supporting actors. They'll bring back particular monsters and alien, species, and then they do things like Shin Ultraman, where they do a whole new, So if only Dark Shadows could do that, then that would go such a long way, in my opinion, to keeping it in the world. Put it that way.
Would you rather see that sequel versus a remake or a reboot?
Yes, I would. Absolutely, because honestly, I think it it hasn't been done before.
Yep.
So why not see if that's what, is the one that finally
Right.
keeps Dark Shadows in the public eye.
Yeah, because 3 reboots failed to do it. The one
Yeah.
that hasn't been made is the continuation. And I think that's the one that has the shot.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
Yep.
because you're also going to draw in a great percentage of the the current fan base. Another reboot, you might lose how many of those people.
Yeah.
I don't think I'd watch a reboot.
Would you accept a new actor as Barnabas? Can they do Dark Shadows without Barnabas though?
Yeah, they did it.
Definitely.
They've done it in the audios.
That's true. That's true. Although they did bring him
He
in.
had to change his appearance in the audios,
Well,
and
right, yeah.
it's been
He is
effective.
the character is there though, the Barnabas
Right.
character. So would you be okay with recasting the role then?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Mhm.
I'm going to be the dissenting vote here. I don't think I would. I think I'd rather have it be written in a way that his presence or spirit or legend hangs over the storyline. But yeah, I think that would be hard. I think that would be really, really hard, to see somebody else. They'd have to just be so good.
I would have said that at one point, but I don't know. When Mark DeWidziak was on here, he talked about, great roles in theater and Shakespeare, and that many different actors can, Richard Burton can play Hamlet, Laurence Olivier can play Hamlet. Can Barnabas be played by different actors?
But when you have one guy, who created, see, that's where I get.
What about
into
Leonard
Star
Nimoy
Trek
as
thing.
Spock though? They've done new.
I know.
At
and
this point, we've had a
I
dozen
can't
different actors if you
accept
count
that.
the young ones. Yeah.
You don't like any of the new Spocks?
People have brought, when I complained about, recasting the Star Trek roles, people said, you're a Batman fan. Batman's been played by how many people? And I said, but that's because Batman existed before he was ever on celluloid.
Right.
William Shatner is a co-creator of the character of Captain Kirk. It's hard for me to take him out of that equation. And I get it. He's too old to play the part or whatever. I don't expect that. It's like, I would rather just have it rest, than because
Let me ask you this then, Jim. How do you feel about the second Sam Evans?
Oh.
I say that because if we had kept the first Sam Evans, I don't think any of us would like Sam Evans.
Right. Or Willie. How about Willie?
Or Willie.
Okay, Rich, let's talk about Burke Devlin.
I'm so sorry because I'm sorry. I feel like I'm challenging you on everything.
No,
and
Burke
No,
Devlin.
no.
Yeah. Good point. Good counterpoint with Burke Devlin.
No. I agree with you on Burke. Yeah.
It's second Burke Devlin or nothing.
I don't think you can. I don't think anybody will ever, surpass Jonathan Fritz's performance. But I think somebody could, if they cast somebody with gravitas and who had that kind of background as an actor, that could, maybe you could do something where you have a new person, maybe bringing in their own spin to it. I mean, I thought I had some issues with Ben Cross, but I thought, if you're going to cast somebody as Barnabas who isn't Jonathan Frid, I thought he was pretty good.
I lived with somebody who loved Jonathan Frid more than I thought possible for a human being, but liked Ben Cross a lot.
Yeah.
And liked Jim Fife.
Yes.
Yeah.
He was too Don Knotts for me. I'm sorry.
No, that's Barney Fife.
Yeah.
But who and this person loved John Carlin to death, but did actually like Jim Fife.
Yeah, he was funny.
I very much agree with Becky because Willie, the new Willie, was a lot funnier than I was expecting him to be.
Nutloaf.
Nutloaf.
Honestly, I didn't think it was a great show, but I did think that the casting, for the most part, was really quite good.
Yeah.
Yes.
As soon as I found out Barbara Steele was playing Dr. Julia Hoffman, I was all in. I was like, they cast Barbara Steele as Dr. Hoffman. That's amazing. So
Gene Simmons as Elizabeth.
yes, what a great
Yes,
choice
without
too.
a
Yeah,
doubt.
Roy Thinnes as Roger. He didn't capture the Roger quality that I was looking for, but it's Roy Thinnes. I mean,
Yeah, well, there's
fingers,
there's no replacing Louis.
no, never, no.
You
That
know,
would be a
there's
tough
no
role to
replacing
recast.
Laura Parker either, but I have to
True.
admit that I liked Angelique.
Lizette Anthony.
Lizette
Lizette
Anthony. Yeah,
Anthony.
and
There you go.
Joanna, is it Goings?
Going, yeah.
Joanna
I think.
Going. Yeah, Joanna
Played.
I
Going.
thought she was
um,
really
He was
good.
very good. Yes, I agree.
I'm going to say something blasphemous. I think she's the best Vicky of all of them that we've ever had.
Ooh, them's fighting words. You can send
know.
your hate
I
mail
know.
to Rich.
No,
She
Yeah,
was
no,
very
I'm
good.
gonna
I thought
agree
she
with
was
we
Rich
had
very
on
good.
6
I'm gonna
Vickies now. I
agree
think
with
she's the
Rich.
best.
Yeah,
She was
I'm
very
gonna
she
agree
was
with
very
Rich.
good. Yeah,
Sorry,
you agree?
Alexandra.
Yeah. I you know, and I know that Alexandra has her fans, and my stepmom is one of them because she loves to talk about the fact that she went to acting academy with her.
Oh, did
But
she really? That's so
yeah,
cool.
even
Yeah.
before I had seen Dark Shadows regularly, I have a stepmom who's a person who went to acting academy and then didn't become an actress, and it matters to her a lot that she went to school with Alexandra Monk.
Wow, that's so cool.
Yeah, but despite that fact, I have to be honest and say that I thought Going was, of the 6 actors who played her in the various media,
Yeah.
I thought she was the best one by
Okay.
far. And I know you're probably going to get a ton of hate mail for me over that.
They can send it to you.
Yeah.
Charles, what about you?
Oh, I was just wondering how anyone could think that, but okay.
Yay. I love Joanna Going too. She was great. But I mean, to me, the sort of the archetypal Victoria Winters is
Let me
Alexandra.
throw this out here. Now, say that, okay, we're not going to have Barnabas on a reboot.
Uh-huh.
Would you be okay if we had another vampire who had a similar issue?
I think it could work.
Particularly if it was somebody who was related. You know, we don't know what happened with Barnabas, presumably was human at the end of the series.
Yeah.
If he and Julia had any children,
Yeah.
and one came back to Collinwood searching for his roots and somehow gets vampirized, and then he's heard everything from his father all these years. So he has a layer there that he has to deal with.
All right, I am on board.
That's
I'm on
how I
board
would-
with 98% of that. I've never been someone who agreed with the fandom that Barnabas should have ended up with Julia.
I agree with you, Rich. I don't think that would happen.
No, I'm
Yeah, I
not
think
saying
it's
that, but that's
yeah.
kind of that's what
Yeah.
Sam Hall sort of led us.
Yeah, oh, I
to.
know, yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's what the
If
novels
that's what-
did,
He was
too.
also
Yeah, yeah.
married to Grace.
Sure,
Yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
okay.
I wouldn't
Maggie,
want that either, but that's kind of where they, you know, that's where they went. If
Maggie gets out of Windcliff. Maggie
good with
gets
another
out of
mother.
Windcliff. She comes back. Her and Barnabas get married. How's that?
No,
Should
I think
Barnabas
it should be none of the women Barnabas ever abused. That's
Should,
what I think.
yes, agree.
Yeah.
Should Barnabas? I'm going to just throw. Danny Horn posted this on his blog. Why should Barnabas be with anyone? Barnabas has caused so much damage to. I love Barnabas Collins. He's my favorite fictional character. But
he deserves to die alone.
But not die. Just live forever.
No.
Just,
Barnabas loves women too much. He's almost addicted to women. I think he will always look to be with somebody.
I think he would hurt Julia. Like, I don't think that he. I think he loves Julia. He cares for Julia. I don't think he is in love with Julia, and you can't force that to happen. I mean, it's not. I feel
Barnabas is a dog in many ways. Barnabas is a dog. He has an eye for the beautiful ladies. He treats them badly.
And I love Barnabas. I think his dad, the train wreck that is Barnabas Collins is fascinating. And I love Barnabas, and I, root for him when he's doing cool things, but I don't Pardon the interruption, and if you hate these interruptions that I sometimes feel compelled to put into the podcast, please let me know. But I wanted to elaborate here. I'm one of those people who hated the fact that Mulder and Scully got together on The X-Files. I thought they worked better as allies and friends, but there was this tidal wave of people at that time, I remember, that really wanted them to be a couple, and Chris Carter caved and did it, and I hated that. I thought they worked better as friends. But there's this tendency that a lot of fans have to always do this shipping thing and put people in relationships. And Barnabas and Julia is a big one. We saw that Julia was in love with Barnabas, and as their relationship grew over the course of the show, this became a thing. And I know there are going to be Julia fans that are going to be coming after me with pitchforks and torches for saying this, but I just don't see it. I have many male friends, some of which are very dear, close friends. I have friends who are like my brothers. That doesn't mean we need to be together. They're family to me, and that's how I see Barnabas and Julia as their relationship developed. I love the symbolism there of identifying themselves as brother and sister in 1840. Yes, that's kind of how I see that dynamic, or the Holmes and Watson dynamic that developed as the series went along. I get that many fans identify with Julia's unrequited love, and we've all been there. Well, I shouldn't say all, but a lot of people have experienced that. But I just don't see that relationship working. For one, just because one person is in love with another person doesn't mean that person has to love them back. And he surely, clearly cares about Julia. And he is clearly aware of the fact that she has those feelings for him, but he doesn't discuss it with her. It's too awkward and it's hurtful. He doesn't want to go there. He is aware of it, but he's not in love with Julia. You can't if somebody's in love with you and you love them, you care about them as a friend, and you find out they're in love with you, your heart might break for them, but it's not going to mean that all of a sudden you're going to realize that you're in love with them. Most of the time, a lot of the time, hey, that's happened to me. I've had somebody express that to me in the past, and I didn't feel that way. I'm not going to pretend that I do, because that's just going to end very badly. That's not going to work, right? Think about it. I know we're talking about fictional characters as if they're real people. It's kind of ridiculous, but this is what I love doing, is exploring this kind of stuff. So excuse me for that. Also, continuing on, 98% of the time, Dark Shadows doesn't have happy endings. There are a few exceptions, mostly in 1841 parallel time when they wrapped up the entire series. And in the regular time band, it seems that Desmond and Letitia have a happy ending. But we didn't see how that went 10 years down the road. I don't know. But we know 1841, parallel time, those couples had happy endings. Most of the time, Dark Shadows doesn't have happy endings. It's one tragedy after another, and we all know it. So I love Julia and I love Barnabas as characters, but I just don't see anything resembling a healthy romantic relationship happening with Barnabas and Julia. Or really, I have to be honest, with Barnabas and anyone. There's just a lot of damage there. Think about what he became undead. Even if this is a Barnabas with the curse lifted, think about all of the intense trauma and damage. He was an undead creature of the night for almost 200 years. He is a mass murderer. He has coldly murdered people. Even when he was being heroic, he still murdered a lot of people. Julia could kind of be amoral and self-serving, especially early on. Julia, and as a hugely duplicitous character, she lies a lot, but she's not at that level of what Barnabas has done. And Barnabas, as Rich and Jim pointed out here, Barnabas has an eye for the young ladies, the sweet young things. The fandom always jokes about that, but that's kind of what Barnabas always does that. So what happens when Maggie Evans gets out of Wyncliffe, or the next Josette lookalike comes along, or Roxanne shows up again somehow? I just don't see it happening, and I don't see it happening really with Barnabas and anyone until maybe after about 200 years of therapy, and then the curse is lifted. Then maybe Barnabas is ready to enter the dating scene. I don't know. And I love Barnabas. Barnabas is also can be very heroic. He was the defender of the family in many ways. He was also the murderer of many family members as well. That's what Jonathan Frid loved playing. He loved playing the good and evil in that character. The darkness in Barnabas is a whole lot darker than the darkness in Julia. And I don't know, like I just think that's bad news. That's why I always say Barnabas and Angelique. There are a lot of people hate Angelique, but there are a lot of similarities between the two of them. A lot of people hate Adam too for the very things that Barnabas embodies. Adam is a dark shadow of Barnabas. Adam is very similar to Barnabas in many ways. And guess what? Adam, I also think, will end up alone too. I think Adam is wandering the earth, or probably got thrown back in time when Barnabas went to the past. Maybe their tie got severed somehow. I don't think the Sam Hall article is accurate in how it describes what would happen to Adam. The Sam Hall article was written without Dan Curtis. Okay, Dan Curtis is the one who made all the big decisions on the show. He called the shots on story, on character, with input from the writers. Absolutely. They would pitch stuff to him. He would either like it or dislike it, and he would tell them, we're doing this. Find a way to work this into the story. He was in charge. He was not involved with this article. Sam Hall wrote the article. Sam Hall was the head writer on the show, or the, unofficial head writer on the show, but he was. But he's not the end all be all. Without Dan Curtis's seal of approval on that, and Dan Curtis saying, "Yep, that's what would have happened," it's not the real deal. It's not canon. There was no input from Gordon Russell as well. Gordon Russell, major writer on the show, along with Sam Hall. Violet Wells, who was still involved up until the end, but ghostwriting scripts for Gordon. She was credited all through 1897, but she also wrote a bunch of other stuff too in the show. I mean, yeah, Sam, absolutely. Some of those ideas Sam Hall had may have found their way into the show. Some of it wouldn't. So thus, you know what? It's not canon. And if that Sam Hall article is part of your head canon, great. But I put that Sam Hall article in the same category I put Return to Collinwood. All right, or the Big Finish audio dramas. It's interesting. You got the original cast back, doing the voices, playing their characters again. But that Sam Hall article is parallel time. It's one parallel time. The Big Finish audio's a different parallel time. The Ross novel's a different parallel time. That's how I see it. And I know a lot of people just shake their heads and go, "Oh, why are we talking about canon?" That's what we do, man. That's what these fictional worlds are there for. It's fun to explore those fictional worlds and discuss what's canon and what's not canon. You ever bring up canon to a Star Wars fan and see what happens? If you tell them, well, canon doesn't matter, good luck with that. You're going to be in for an earful on that. And Star Trek, and Dark Shadows is, hey, it's part of that ongoing massive universe with a lot of world building, right? So of course we're going to talk about what's canon and what isn't canon. So it's an interesting debate. What do you think? Do you think the Sam Hall article is canon? Is that what happens next? Do you believe that? Or do you believe Return to Collinwood is canon? What's your take on that? Leave a comment if you're watching the YouTube version of this, or drop me a line at terror@collinwood@gmail.com and let me know what you think. For me, it's what happened in the show is canon. Everything else is gravy. All right, let's get back to it. I mean, ultimately, he says he loves Angelique, and it's like, well, that's interesting, but it kind of makes sense. I always kind of see the two of them as kind of two sides of the same coin.
I mean, realistically, it wouldn't be that difficult to bring her back either.
Oh, totally. Yeah, she'd be great. Yeah. I mean, Lara's. I would be great to see Lara back. I don't know.
I was just watching that episode the other day, and I'm like, well, she's shown up in so many different time periods. Sometimes she remembers things, sometimes she doesn't.
Yeah.
So you killed her at this time period. You're going to see her as Cassandra later.
Yeah.
There's a lot of ways to work that. We can work around this.
When she works for the devil, it's very easy to find a way to bring her.
Totally right.
Yeah.
Yes,
that
exactly.
Was so cool.
Her boss is literally Satan, so it's very easy to find a way to bring her back. If you
see,
Quentin,
practically there.
And Quentin, Quentin would be difficult because unless they figured out a way to, if they brought David Selby in.
Well, they could say that he has artificially aged himself so people don't notice that he's
maybe got Angelique to make him look older. Yeah, it would be interesting.
Or at a certain point, he destroyed the painting.
But then wouldn't he revert to being a werewolf?
Yeah, well, also that's the other thing. He'd be a werewolf, but wouldn't he also turn into what the painting was?
100 years old. Yeah, he'd be like 100 years old. I always wanted to see what they showed what the Dorian Gray painting in the present day, what it looked like. I always wanted to see it during a full moon, like in 1970, to see if it's like an old werewolf.
It's really old.
They should have done that.
That would have been cool.
Yeah, you could still do it. So it might be necessary to recast somebody. But yeah,
Yeah, very cool.
Ironically, the one that would be the easiest to bring back has no interest, and that's David Hennessy.
Oh, well,
Yeah.
he's in Panama as a successful restaurateur. He's
he's
Yeah.
also
been,
the easiest to replace though, because people often look nothing like themselves when they're older.
Right.
yeah.
Although I got, when they did that reunion, I was like, damn, he looks like an older bearded version of himself as a kid. That's
Yeah, he
Yeah.
does. He really does. Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad to see he's
Yeah.
been doing more stuff lately. And
Yeah.
Alec Newman, who played Barnabas in the 2004 unaired pilot, is David in the audio, Big Finish audios, and he does a
And he's
good
good.
job as David. I think
Wow.
Yeah,
I
he
could
does
see-
a great job as him.
I could see him
Huh.
as a live action David too. He'd be
Mhm.
great. But now one thing too, I think when we talked about the idea of Dark Shadows kind of slipping away in pop culture a little bit, although hey, we're on a Dark Shadows podcast talking about dark, and you all participated in this great book about
Yeah,
Dark
that's why I don't think it's
Yeah.
going away. It's 'cause
So,
it's
Yeah,
like,
and
yeah.
apologies to my co-guests, but we're the old guard, though.
Yeah, true.
You know?
True. Well, hey, well,
Indeed.
I had a group of young fans in their 20s on, they run a Dark Shadows Discord. And so I was glad to see a new
Good.
generation of Dark Shadows
Good.
fans.
Good.
And they have their
They
own
they
community.
see
and everything.
they're the ones they've got to keep passing it on.
You
You
got to
know?
keep, and keep,
But
even we do.
Jim,
I
keep
like,
in mind that I'm not a monster. I'm not a first generation Dark Shadows kid. Remember,
Well,
so
I'm
you were a baby. That's right. You were
I mean,
a
I
baby.
grew up with it was a
sort of
present.
not either.
Yeah, I when I was growing up, my mom watched it and I didn't, but I ended up into so many other things she was into. It's surprising I didn't. But it was
Yeah.
only about a decade ago that I finally watched the show in full. I had watched like isolated episodes on Sci-Fi Channel before they stupidly named it Sci-Fi, and I didn't ever. I mean, I liked it, but I didn't have the context. I was never what you'd call a fan because it was. I don't even know what I'm watching right now.
Yeah.
Without the like, you tune in for one episode of the Leviathan arc, and it's like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
But 10 years ago is when I got the coffin that's sitting behind Danielle, and so if I came into it in my 40s, I think that right there says people are still coming into it.
And you're spreading
know?
the word to your friends too. You have friends watching it now too, which I have a
Mhm.
couple of friends who started getting into it also.
I
Which
came into it in my 20s, but
it was
but I had a gateway drug.
yeah.
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 I highly recommend meeting and marrying somebody who's a huge Dark Shadows fan, because I don't know if that had never happened. I don't.
Yeah.
I would know what it is. I would understand what it is, and I would understand its place in pop culture. But I probably wouldn't have done a book, on it, and so that really helped to have somebody very, very excited about the show, as your companion in
Yeah.
life.
One thing in terms of keeping Dark Shadows on the map that is a challenge, I think, too. And I've mentioned this on the podcast before. When I went to the 2016 San Diego Comic-Con, there was it was the anniversary of Star Trek and of Batman 66, and there was Batman 66 and Star Trek stuff everywhere. Zero Dark Shadows stuff. Like, I mean, there was a panel. Hermes Press did a panel, and I think Lara and Catherine were there, I'm pretty sure. But that's it. And I mentioned this before, and Will McKinley, who's been on the podcast, pointed out that, Batman and Star Trek have huge corporations backing behind them.
Thank you.
Dark Shadows is owned by Dan Curtis's daughters. So it's not owned by this big company.
It all depends on who's behind it and pushing it.
And that's
exactly what that was all about. Yeah.
And it's tough. I mean, it's difficult how, they don't have that kind of, capital or whatever to push Dark Shadows into this, keep it in the spotlight in that same way. And that can be a challenge. So it is kind of up to us. I mean, it's on Tubi, it's accessible, you can watch it, but in terms of like promoting it and keeping it in the zeitgeist.
They need to have Disney buy it.
Oh no. Disney Dark Shadows. It would be like the Haunted Mansion. It would what? That's all I could think of. I don't know what a Disney Dark Shadows would be like.
Well, that would then
I don't want to think of
it. Disney princess.
Yeah. Josette.
It's a shame too, because if you think about the storylines in Dark Shadows, outside of Dark Shadows, Dracula is still popular. Frankenstein is still popular. I mean, The Mummy kind of faltered, but it keeps coming back. And I know that they didn't do The Mummy, but I mean, I'm talking about universal monsters. The idea is that these classic monster types are still popular.
Sure.
Right? Ghosts will always be popular. You just mentioned Haunted Mansion. Haunted Mansions are still popular.
Yeah.
So with the right backing and the right marketing, Dark Shadows could end up popular because it has so many elements that are still popular. The problem is it is a soap opera, and for a lot of people that is a stop. That's the barrier. I think
know.
part of the reason I didn't watch it for so many years is because even though I grew up watching horror from day one, it's a soap opera.
There's
and
a
I don't
stigma.
think I recognize that it's funny because you can't say I'm going to watch all of, Guiding Light unless you can figure out how to become immortal. Right. So just because there's so much of it, but you can say I'm going to watch 1,200 17-minute episodes.
Yeah.
You can do it in half a year. But it's still daunting. It's just to set out to do that is still really daunting.
Yep.
Once you start doing it, you get pulled in, you get hooked. And that's how I think they need to market it. They need to make it clear that in an era in which streaming channels have made binge watching the way to watch everything, there's nothing more binge worthy than a 1,200 episode ongoing tale.
Yeah. And that's wise that MPI markets it as a serial or a series. They don't, and I rarely invoke the phrase soap opera on the podcast just because there's a stigma attached to it. And you just confirmed it. I mean, it's people, if horror fans, if they hear, oh, it's a soap opera, they're like, what? I want to watch a soap opera. But if you say, oh, it's like an ongoing story about vampires and werewolves and witches and ghosts.
That's why I ultimately watched it in the end, because I wanted that aspect of it.
Yeah.
And then I got pulled into the soap operatic stuff.
Totally. Yeah. You get sucked into all of that.
Yeah.
There's also the stigma of it beginning in black and white. And I'm discovering that with Doctor Who.
Yeah.
Because for the podcast, we started from the very beginning. And, we're putting out our episodes of our podcast and we're trying to get people, listen to it and to start to see like, oh, I don't really want to watch that really old, the first few years of it are in black and white. Like
it's on video and the special effects are bad.
Yeah. I hear all of that too.
But boy, does that, that's the more I think about it, it's just so many parallels to Dark Shadows that the early Doctor Who. Yeah.
Definitely. That's been mentioned on this podcast several times. There's definitely a kinship there. In fact, I have friends who are huge Doctor Who fans and they can't do Dark Shadows. And I'm like, you're watching these like old Doctor Who episodes. It's not a far cry from early Dark Shadows.
I'm doing it. Here I am. I'm okay.
Yeah.
I think
during the height of the pandemic, I marathoned both Doctor Who and Dark Shadows to keep myself sane.
Wow.
Everything from Hartnell to Capaldi and then Whitaker.
Wow.
So it was pretty wild.
It's a lot of Doctor Who.
Yeah, they're both still just such amazing shows.
Yeah.
But those early seasons, Jim, are a little tougher to get through when you're marathoning it.
I totally see what you're saying. I just watched The Underwater Menace, and that was not the greatest.
Yeah, some of them are like, wow, okay, yeah. And I watched them all, including the reconstructions of the ones that are missing. Mm-hmm. And there were times when I went, please, John Pertwee can't get here fast enough. And I love Hartnell and Troughton. Troughton's one of my favorites. But getting through those missing episodes is tough.
They use the audio, right? They animate it with the audio, right?
Yeah. Well,
some of them are animated. Some of them are just stills on the set.
I'm right in the worst of it right now.
What's that?
I'm right in the worst of it right now.
Yeah. There's that stretch where it's like
the biggest
so many missing
episodes. They call them telesnaps because they had a guy on the set taking multiple.
We're really lucky that exists.
And fans were sitting at home recording it on there were fans that recorded every single episode, and that's why we have the audio today, not because of the BBC. And this is funny because my person that did the same thing. She had a reel-to-reel recorder and she recorded Dark Shadows episodes.
Yep.
Because how else would you revisit them
Sure. I
back
mean,
then?
Jim, that's the subject of my afterword in your book. That when I grew up, my mom and her friend Ed had used to revisit Dark Shadows after recording it on PBS on audio cassette.
mhm.
And so I would be there and they would talk about the creepy vampire and the beautiful witch. And they had these things they would always talk about.
Yeah.
And they were they were gushing the way we would gush about the latest MCU or Star Trek stuff.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
But they were only listening to it. They watched all of it, but they were like, they would sit there like over the tape recorder listening, you
Yeah.
know, and
I love
this
it.
is, yeah. So yeah, I totally get where you're coming from.
You could get some of those from back in the day. The last year of Dark Shadows is not available in syndication. So I got a couple of tapes of the 1840 storyline that way from fans that had recorded it. And it's how we have the one lost episode of Dark Shadows. We have the audio for it because a fan had recorded it.
We are so lucky it's just one.
Yeah,
Is that right?
it's amazing.
It is just one.
It's just one,
Just one.
But we have the audio for it thanks to Josette.
And for that
Cunningham.
one episode, Laura Parker filmed a scene where she's sitting as Angelique describing the action.
Yeah, yep. And then it cuts to the audio and you see images, they show pictures and then but when I was
we're lucky. If the BBC had done it, the entire show would be missing.
I was gonna say they were just, wholesale wiping tapes.
Right.
Left and right.
When I was a kid, I used to also record the Munsters and the Addams Family on audio cassette, so I could listen to them whenever I wanted. So I mean, it was pre-VCR days.
Hey,
so I would
kids, the struggle is real.
Yeah.
Right.
That's the way we rolled back then.
Yeah. No, and I think it's difficult too for current generations, perhaps, to look at these shows in the proper context. I think people have a tendency, like Charles said, kind of people poo-pooing the special effects or that it's in black and white, like you were saying, Jim, too. And it's like you have to put yourself in the mindset, I think, of what things were like at that time and suspend disbelief. And I think a lot of people have difficulties suspending disbelief.
Yes.
I'd rather see a practical effect, even if it doesn't come off as well, versus, some CGI thing that's just kind of, there's no heart in it, I guess, when it was a lot of the times with the not always, I shouldn't say that like across the board with CGI stuff, but sometimes it's just you're watching, I feel like I'm watching a video game and I'm like, well,
that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Try explaining to somebody underage, say 30, what a photo novel is. But just like you were describing with the audio cassettes, those photo novels had real purpose, because if you couldn't find Star Trek or whatever movie it was you liked, that like Close Encounters, if you couldn't find it on your local TV broadcast, but you had a book with 600 photo stills, it was like re-experiencing the movie. Now there'd be not much of a point in putting out photo novels, but back then it was vital, and that's something that has kind of gone the way of the dodo.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, I think the lack of other types of media for Dark Shadows also hurts it, because Star Trek, Batman, you've got comics, you've got animated series, there are novels, there are, there's tons of stuff out there.
Yeah.
Dark Shadows, we're not getting a lot of new material.
And that's a great segue, just to close things off here. I recently had Catherine Cressman and Stephen Mark Rainey on the podcast. And I mentioned to them, Jim, your idea of a Dark Shadows fiction anthology, and that you had pitched it at one time, and it was they gave a thumbs down on that idea, which breaks my heart, because I think that would be amazing. And they were both excited about the idea too. So I would love to see a Dark Shadows fiction anthology come out with.
Well, when Jim was talking about that, he and I discussed it, and it's, I've edited several anthologies now. I know everyone. That's the running joke. Charles knows everyone.
That's true.
I could get tons of actual horror writers to do new Dark Shadows stories tomorrow.
Folks, look, if you want something like this, make some noise, on social media, or I don't know if this kind of stuff gets back to, Jim Pearson or whatever, but if you are in touch with Jim Pearson and put the bug in his ear, that this would be such a cool thing. And I don't know, Hermes Press has been doing a lot of Dark Shadows reprints. I don't know if they have the rights to do fiction releases, but I suspect they might now, because they just did a coloring book, which was not a reprint of vintage material, which I know that's not a fiction book, but it's something new. So that tells me maybe they could do more new things.
So
I recently spoke to Jim Pearson, and oh, sorry, what?
No, go ahead, Rich.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I recently spoke with Jim Pearson, and I brought up the idea of a fiction anthology, and same reaction.
It sounds like what we were up against when we did the Planet of the Apes fiction anthology, and that barely got through because we kept being told over and over again that fiction anthologies don't sell.
Which was maddening, because we had such a good lineup of writers, and the book was really well received. We hardly got anything negative said about us in the reviews. And we had an entire lineup ready to saying, put me in the second book, and I'm sure we would have kept being.
I was one of those.
Yeah, exactly. And what Titan told us was, we love the book, we'd love to do more. There's just no market for fiction anthologies.
Well, I don't get it. Actually hurts. Obviously a company wants something to sell. They're going to sink some money into it, and I get that. But if it's not a blockbuster seller, then kind of so what? It's another way to keep the property alive.
Right.
Have you guys seen what they're doing with the Conan stuff now, where they're going to have short stories and novellas just online? They're not published. They're just ebooks. But if they do well, they'll collect them.
Look how many hundreds and hundreds of short stories there are for Star Trek and Star Wars.
Yeah.
And every time they put out a new one, people clamor to read it. Yep. If you market it right, there's definitely a market for sure.
Yeah, I agree.
At the very least, you're going to please your fan base if it's done well.
Right.
Luckily, Rich and I, we did it right, and the
Planet of the Apes
fan base literally embraced it like crazy.
Yeah.
We still get people to this day going, when is volume 2 coming out?
To this day. Yep.
Yeah. What was that, 6 years ago?
Yeah.
Something like that, yeah.
I mean, it would be incredible. I know Catherine and Mark both expressed interest in that. I'm sure Mark DeWitziak probably would be in on that.
Greg Cox wanted to do it. Yep.
There you go. The fans of Dark Shadows are going to buy it. And then I think beyond that, I think you're going to get a lot of horror and pop culture fans that are going to be interested.
Because there's a lot of crossover there. Many of my fellow horror writers are big Dark Shadows fans.
Yeah.
And their readers would buy it.
Yeah. I'm disappointed, Rich, that Jim didn't seem that enthusiastic about that idea, because I think it would be a cool thing. And it also keeps Dark Shadows active in that way, like Charles was saying.
Rich, does he actually have the ability to do it?
That I don't know. I could ask him.
Okay.
That I don't know. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, they tend to break up pieces of rights like that. So whereas Hermes maybe, can reprint the original novels, they may not be able to do anything new. The new fiction, the rights may literally not be anywhere at the moment. They may literally still be with Curtis Productions or whatever.
I wonder,
which is a shame, because I actually, I read those 5 non-Marilyn Ross books during the pandemic as well. I read the Marilyn Ross book. I went nuts. I really immersed myself. But I read all of the Marilyn Ross books, and I was like,
then they set you to Wyncliffe after that.
Yeah. It's funny with those books. There are 5 that are pre-Barnabas, and then there's, I think it's 5, and then 27 of exactly the same book after that, because once Barnabas shows up, every single book is, the man with the Inverness coat shows up, and the woman goes, and then he, I cannot be with you, I must be alone, and then there's somebody evil, and half the time it's Quentin, and half the time it's not, and then it's always the same. So like somehow I sat there and just barreled through all 32 of these books. And I laughed about the fact that after Barnabas showed up, I was always reading the same book over over and over again.
Yeah.
But then I got
Dig the Vampire.
These are fun. I mean, there were decisions made that I didn't agree with, but I really enjoyed all 5 of them.
Did you read all of Lara's?
Yeah, that's what that's what I'm talking about. Lara's
okay.
for, and then
That's what I'm talking about. Okay.
Stevens
Dreams of the Dark.
Mark Rainey's, yeah, his book was good. And then there's a second one that he wrote that was never published that he put online. I read that and I thought that was pretty good too.
Oh yeah, the Quentin one. Yep.
Mhm.
Yep.
Yeah, so I mean, I think these are good. If they even when there's missteps where I go, yeah, I don't know, maybe describing Grayson as being hideously ugly was not a nice thing to do.
Who did that?
Well, so here's the thing.
Penny's on the warpath now.
No, I'm just like,
said
that's not a nice thing to say.
I adore Laura Parker.
And that's not true. Oh, Lara said that.
So in one of her books, she basically kept describing how beautiful Angelique was and how Julia was not. And I kept reading this going, given that you're Angelique and Julia was your friend in real life, maybe that wasn't very nice.
No.
But yeah, I was like,
well, Angelique,
you know what
that.
Rich, you know what they say, history is written by the winners.
The winners.
Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, yeah, I mean, hopefully we'll see new things like this anthology. I would love to see this happen. Charles mentioned the idea of a cartoon was pitched at one time years ago to Dan Curtis Productions when Dan was still alive, like an HBO adult, mature cartoon for Dark Shadows, which I thought would have been kind of cool because you could have had the actors in. My friend Eric Marshall, for the anniversary of Dark Shadows a couple of years ago, we released this Dark Shadows as a Hanna-Barbera cartoon in the 70s. Animation sells phony animation art, so I posted that on my blog over at the Terror at Collinwood blog. If you haven't seen it, Eric is an incredible artist. He did the logo for this podcast, and he did like this dead-on Hanna-Barbera designs for the characters.
They're amazing. Yeah, it was almost like Filmation,
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yep,
those are amazing.
That whole vibe. Yeah,
we're in an era where you could do that easily now. That's why I would love to see that. Look at how they've reanimated the Lost Doctor Who's.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh golly, yeah.
So
they should do that with the lost episode of Dark Shadows. That would be awesome.
I wish they would. I mean, heck, you could take the Big Finish audio cast of Dark Shadows, get an animating team, and you could continue the show with those actors.
We can
rebuild Jim wouldn't
them.
want it
we
because
have
it's
the
a
technology.
Barnabas,
yeah. Well, that's what they've been talking about. Guy Haynes mentioned recently, because of the Darren Gross, has all the footage, put together the footage for Night of Dark Shadows, the lost footage to release, ideally, eventually, the director's cut of Night of Dark Shadows. There is some missing audio, and they got the original surviving actors back to spot the missing audio, but Grayson sadly is no longer with us, and they were going to recast Grayson. But now with AI, you could probably do that with AI. If you have good AI and you do sample Grayson Hall's voice, you can probably do it. I recently listened to, it was an AI version of Johnny Cash singing Barbie Girl. And I was it sounded just like Johnny Cash. It was crazy.
That's so funny.
It was crazy. So, I mean, it's amazing the things they can do now.
I love the idea of animating that lost episode. That's just genius.
Oh my gosh. They should totally get on that. I'm sure it would cost. It probably might not be cheap, but with the technology now, that the things that you can do. I mean, I've seen Dark Shadows fans animating little Dark Shadows cartoons. I think it's Emster on the Dark Shadows Discord. She's been doing like these really cool Dark Shadows music videos with cartoon versions of the characters. And it's like kind of, computer art, flash art, not flash. I don't know what they call it now. I have no idea, but it looks good. But I think if you did like a nice animated version of that lost episode,
that's what the Doctor Who ones are. They're drawn more or less like cell animation, but it is still computer animation. I just last night watched part 1 of the Moon Base, Rich, and I love the animation for that one. Sometimes you get some of them, they're not that
Sometimes
good.
it's a bit off, yeah.
Yeah,
But-
that
but-
one was really fun, and I really
Yeah.
enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And the truth is, every one of them is better than watching telesnaps. Like I hope we eventually have them all like that, because then I'm gonna have to just bite the bullet and rewatch it again.
Yeah.
You say that as if that was a bad thing.
It's just a lot, you know. It's like
Yeah, I
it's a
hear ya.
lot.
Yeah.
I hear ya.
But no, it would not be a bad thing. I'm actually kind of itching for another Doctor Who marathon. Dark Shadows marathon. It's been 2 years, and I'm kind of itching to do it again now.
There you go. Maybe it will inspire you to write a Dark Shadows piece for the anthology that we're going to will into existence. So in closing, we got to jump out of here, but we hear about anything new that you guys have coming out or that's available now? Anything you want to plug here?
Okay, I have a Star Trek book coming out to talk
Cool.
about another big huge genre franchise. So it'll be the 5th volume of the same series that the Dark Shadows book is in. Running Home to Shadows was volume 3 of Memories from Today's Grown-Up Kids, and Galloping Around the Cosmos will be volume 5 of that same series, and it's 25 different essayists talking about their childhood memories of watching classic Star Trek for the first time. I'm about halfway through the editing, so it'll be fall, you know, hopefully by the end of this month. This is the beginning of September, so hopefully by the end of September, the book will be out. You'll see it on Amazon, and then if you hop over on Facebook to the Jim Beard and Becky Books page, you're going to see all the updates on it there. And Rich is in that book. I don't know how he could not be.
Unlike Dark Shadows, that was something I was basically born watching. So yeah, I had to be in that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
And,
okay, so a book Lou Tambone and I co-edited called "The Man Who Laughs: Exploring the Clown Prince of Crime" just
cool.
came out.
About the Joker?
It's about the Joker, and there are
Nice.
a lot of Bob Rozakis and Steve Englehart, and there's a lot of people in this that are just, I can't believe we got them. But that's out from Crazy 8 Press. I've got 2 books coming out, one very soon, one next year, from Bear Manor Media. The first is Born on the Bayou, a pre-Flashpoint chronology of Swamp Thing and Hellblazer. Nice. Which is in the same vein as a bunch of timeline books that I wrote years ago. I can't believe I wrote another one, because honestly, there's so much work. But I had this thing sitting on my in my head and on my laptop for almost 20 years, and I kept coming back to it. And it's a look at every single appearance of Swamp Thing and its spin-off Hellblazer before DC revamped everything with Flashpoint. And it's about 1,000 comics that are discussed. Mm-hmm. And then the other one is a book also from Bear Manor that I'm currently working on about the history of Star Trek in comic book form. Right. The only other thing I could think of that I'm currently, I've been writing for Titan Books, Star Trek Explorer magazine, and I'm doing other stuff with Jim that's not announceable yet.
Okay, cool. And very groovy. And Charles, what about you?
I've had a lot of stuff released in the last couple of months. There are 2 sword and sorcery anthologies. There's Swordplay, which was edited by Dan Brereton, Allison Pang, and James A. Moore. And then there's Swords in the Shadows, which was edited by Cullen Bunn. And both of those are, heroic fantasy Conan sort of things. Great. Features one of my continuing characters, Karn, the immortal barbarian. And then I'm also in the Joe Lansdale anthology, The Drive-In Multiplex, edited by Christopher Golden and Brian Keene. And then from Pavan Press, which is Cliff Biggers and I, we just released Lonely Hollows, which is a collection of folk horror. And Becky Beard has a story in that anthology.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
wonderful. It's very cool.
That's wonderful. Wow.
So, Yeah, and I've got a bunch of other stuff, as Bruce was saying. Some of it I can't talk about. So there's stuff, and it's happening.
So Hollywood pitch: Karn shows up at Collinwood.
That kind of already happened. There is a story called All My Sins, which is in Thinly Veiled, the 70s, a book that was Castle of Horror. And in that story, Karn shows up at a mansion in Maine where one of the people who lives there is a vampire, but he's now a human. But some of the people he turned have shown up and have a bone to pick, as it were.
Oh,
So
cool.
You can kind of read a Karn Barnabas crossover if you squint and use your
Barnabas.
imagination.
I
think his
head
name
can't
was,
explode anymore on tonight.
Yeah, I can't remember what I called him, but it wasn't Barnabas. It was, but I think it was. I know his last name was
Barnabas Bullins.
No, his last name was Calkins, and it was
Okay.
It was Barabbas from the Bible.
Oh, sure,
Barabbas.
right, yeah.
Barabbas Calkins.
I actually like the name Carnabas, like carnivore.
Barnabas,
right?
yes. Yeah. It was. I forget where I came up with that, but he's been around since I was a kid. So a lot of my characters were created when I was 12.
I love it. Well, I will put links in the show notes to the 3 of your websites, so folks can check out all of your work. And it's so much amazing stuff to explore and to get lost in and to enjoy. And I really want to thank my 3 guests today, Jim, Rich, and Charles, for joining me on the podcast to talk about Dark Shadows and many other wonderful things. And thank you guys. It's been a pleasure chatting.
Thanks for
with you.
having us.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you.
Really enjoyed it.
My pleasure. We'll have to do it again sometime.
Absolutely.
And for as long as they lived, the dark shadows never truly vanished, for there will always be terror at Collinwood. Terror at Collinwood is a Penny Dreadful production.